Life inside a medieval castle wasn't all banquets and silks. Much of the time, it was simply about getting through long, dark nights. Before the flick of a switch was even imaginable, kings and nobles had to improvise to keep their stone fortresses from feeling like caves. From extravagant methods to humble ones, they developed clever ways to light their world. And when it came to illuminating vast halls, they had no shortage of tricks. The most obvious place to start is with the classic standby, candles. These weren't the dainty things you stick on a birthday cake. They were serious tools of light. The premium choice was the beeswax candle, the crown jewel of medieval illumination. Ordinary folk made do with tallow candles, created from rendered animal fat. Those burned with a greasy smoke and gave off a smell somewhere between a butcher's stall and a backyard grill. Nobles, however, demanded beeswax, which gave a steady flame without coating the room in stench. One good beeswax candle could last nearly 9 hours, perfect for those endless winter evenings when there was nothing to do but sit and talk. The problem was the price. A single candle could cost 6 to 10 pennies, which in medieval terms was the equivalent of splurging $50 modern on a single stick of wax. Now imagine how many you'd need for a castle. A medium-sized fortress might consume 300 to 500 candles every month. The real spectacles, though, were the chandeliers. Massive wooden or iron rings dangled from rafters, crammed with dozens of candles. At feasts they'd light hundreds, transforming the hall into something like Times Square before its time. Servants, balancing on ladders, had to scramble to light them all before dusk, an exhausting task in drafty halls while wearing stiff leather shoes. But candles were about more than light. They were symbols of wealth, like luxury watches today. The more beeswax you burned, the richer you looked. Kings made sure their halls glowed with hundreds of flames to dazzle guests. A casual evening in the royal hall might burn through more money in candles than a peasant saw in a year. Candlelight also shaped how nobles spent their evenings. Instead of streaming shows, they gathered around the glow for storytelling, gossip, or serious political discussions. Important treaties were sometimes read by candlelight, which could explain a few disastrous historical blunders. Try deciphering fine print by flickering fire and see if you don't sign away half your kingdom. Running this system was no small job. Castles had to keep huge reserves of candles, especially during the short days of winter. It was like managing a medieval candle emporium, though instead of racks of lavender breeze or spiced cinnamon, you just needed enough plain beeswax to keep people from tripping over the furniture. Still, candles weren't the only option. Oil lamps offered another solution, especially for smaller spaces. They were the medieval version of table lamps, only instead of plugging them into an outlet, you had to fill them with whatever oil you could find. In southern regions, olive oil was the premium choice, burning bright and clean. Further north, animal fat often had to do the job, filling rooms with smoke and odor. Some households turned to seed oils like flax or nut, while coastal communities sometimes burned fish oil. Imagine the fragrance of cod liver oil smoldering away in your bedroom. Not exactly a luxury spa treatment. The upside was longevity. Oil lamps could burn 12 to 15 hours at a stretch, much longer than candles. That made them especially useful in bedrooms, since no king wanted his chamber plunged into darkness halfway through the night. Their design was straightforward: a container of clay, metal, or ceramic, filled with oil and fitted with a braided wick of hemp, flax, or cotton. It was simple, but safer than experimenting with flammable wood. Many beard-scorching lessons were surely learned along the way. Oil also had a practical advantage. Unlike candles, which required constant production and storage, oil could be stockpiled for long periods and portioned out as needed. It was the smart manager's choice, a kind of medieval bulk buying strategy, less like an impulse luxury and more like having a membership to the castle's version of Costco. The placement of oil lamps inside a castle was practically a design skill of its own. Builders tucked them into wall niches, set them on tables, or suspended them from iron brackets. Some even built reflective stone or polished metal surfaces behind them, bouncing the light around to make a single flame stretch farther. Medieval designers knew what they were doing. The real genius of lamps, though, was how portable they were. Unlike the massive chandeliers that needed a squad of servants and maybe a winch to operate, one person could grab an oil lamp and carry it anywhere. Perfect for those midnight trips to the pantry, those sneaking back upstairs with it dripping. Meat pie while juggling an oil lamp must have been a delicate skill indeed. Of course, refilling them was the tricky part. One slip of the hand, and you'd have oil all over the floor or worse, soaking into an expensive tapestry. And trust me, scrubbing olive oil out of velvet curtains wasn't anyone's idea of fun. Which brings us to the most dramatic source of medieval lighting: torches. If candles were practical and lamps reliable, torches were pure theater. Nothing else could turn a gloomy stone corridor into something out of an epic adventure. They weren't just random sticks set ablaze, though, at least not if you wanted them to last. Craftsmen usually built them from softwoods like pine or fir, around 3 feet long, and then soaked them in pitch, resin, or sap to make them burn longer and hotter. Think of it as medieval lighter fluid, only better, since it worked even in bad weather. But that meant castles devoured staggering amounts of timber. A single fortress might consume between 1,000 and 2,400 pounds of wood every month just for torches. The lumberjacks supplying them probably had arms as thick as the very trees they cut. Torches came in different forms depending on the need. The handheld variety was basically the medieval flashlight, perfect for midnight patrols or late-night snacks. Wall-mounted torches lined corridors like permanent street lamps, while big braziers or torch stands lit courtyards and ceremonial halls. Few things announced authority more loudly than a blazing column of fire at your front gate. Most torches burned for 1 to 2 hours, though the resin-treated kind could stretch to 3 or 4, long enough for a feast, a war council, or an evening wondering why the court jester kept sneaking off toward the wine cellar. Still, even torches needed a counterpart, something steadier, warmer, and central. That's where the fireplace came in, the beating heart of castle life. And these weren't just simple hearths. They were immense, stone-framed focal points that anchored nearly every important room, from the grand hall to the royal chambers. Kitchens had their own versions too, though those were more functional than fashionable. Running them was a monumental task. A decent-sized castle could chew through 2 to 4 cartloads of wood every single day. That's 60 to 120 cartloads a month. Managing the firewood supply was almost its own department. More than one campaign was probably delayed because the castle budget went up in smoke literally. Yet fireplaces were more than heaters. They were status symbols, the medieval equivalent of giant flat-screen TVs. Nobles competed over who could build the largest and most decorative hearths, each one a glowing sign of wealth. The flames didn't throw off the brightest light, but they created a soft, flickering glow that made evenings feel alive. Families, courtiers, and guests would gather around, sharing gossip, plotting politics, or just thawing out frozen toes. Think of it as a medieval coffeehouse, minus the cappuccinos and plus a few broadswords. Even with candles, lamps, torches, and roaring fireplaces, nights were still overwhelmingly dark. And that shaped how people slept. Unlike today's single 8-hour stretch, medieval folks followed a pattern historians call biphasic sleep. At the time, they simply thought of it as normal. The system worked like this. Shortly after sunset, everyone would bed down for their first sleep, which lasted 3 to 4 hours. Then, sometime around midnight, people naturally woke for a short period of wakefulness. This could last 1 to 2 hours, a little window of nighttime activity. What did they do with it? Plenty. Nobles used it to read or dictate letters by candlelight. Kings sometimes held private conversations with advisors, taking advantage of the quiet. Guards got surprise visits from half-drowsy lords, making sure the walls were secure. Some just prayed, meditated, or sat by the fire. Once this midnight interlude ended, they'd drift back into their second sleep, another 3 to 4 hours before sunrise. To them, this rhythm was as ordinary as breathing. To us, it looks like they built in an intermission to every night one that made perfect sense in a world defined by darkness. Everyone in the Middle Ages, from the lowest peasant to the mightiest king, followed the same nightly rhythm. It was as natural to them as scrolling social media is for us. What's really fascinating is how this pattern shaped life inside castles. During that middle-of-the-night wake window, activity quietly buzzed through the halls. Guards swapped shifts, servants busied themselves with chores, and sometimes even the king would shuffle around with a candle in hand, pretending to handle weighty matters of state, but probably just searching for leftover pastries. This wasn't some odd cultural quirk. It was the perfect response to their world. Artificial lighting was scarce and costly, so people's lives ran on the sun's schedule. Winter nights could stretch to 14 hours or longer, far too long to sleep in one stretch. Breaking rest into 2 parts made those endless dark hours bearable and gave everyone something to do besides staring at the ceiling. Daylight, though, was precious, which is why castle builders worked hard to catch every drop of sunshine. Getting natural light into a fortress was like playing a puzzle game with stone walls and arrow slits. Those narrow windows weren't just military features. They were positioned to funnel in light without sacrificing defense. In the Great Hall, windows were often larger and oriented east or south, so the king could hold court in the brightest hours of the day, saving expensive candles. No wonder medieval portraits looked so stern-try, keeping a regal expression while squinting into direct sunlight. Castle courtyards functioned like giant solar batteries. Placed at the heart of the fortress, they became daytime gathering hubs where everyone worked, trained, or socialized. Servants washed laundry, nobles practiced swordplay, and hungry courtiers hunted for the sunniest benches at lunchtime. The smartest builders even perched castles on high ground. This wasn't just for defense. It guaranteed longer hours of daylight and sweeping views. Every important chamber was aligned with the sun's path, almost like today's solar-efficient homes, except instead of charging panels, they were fueling human energy and morale. When the sun dipped, the moon took over. Moonlight became an unofficial ally of castle life, though it was a fickle one. Guards adored a full moon because it let them patrol without waving torches around like glowing targets. Try sneaking when you're holding a personal bonfire. Some rulers even staged moonlit meetings, striking an aura of mystery. Of course, reading treaties in dim moonlight probably explains why so many royal agreements ended up with half-legible signatures. The real problem was that moonlight was unreliable. Clouds could plunge everything into pitch black, and even on clear nights, it wasn't exactly useful for fine tasks. Banquets held under moonlight must have been a mix of elegance and chaos, with nobles politely pretending they hadn't just dunked an elbow into the gravy bowl. So, when the moon failed them, people turned to their most budget-friendly solution, the rushlight. Think of it as the dollar store candle of the medieval world. These humble little torches were made by peeling long rush plants, leaving just a strip of outer skin to support the soft inner pith, then dipping them into animal fat. Voila, instant light source. They weren't built for endurance 15 to 30 minutes of glow at best, but they were cheap, quick to make, and available to everyone. Even the poorest servant could afford to light their way to bed without tripping over the family dog. The only downside? Making them probably left the castle reeking of burnt fat for days. Still, rush lights gave ordinary people their share of brightness. While kings upstairs dictated letters by beeswax candlelight, Servants downstairs patched clothing or scribbled love notes by the glow of their flickering rushes. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Put it all together: candles, oil lamps, torches, fireplaces, moonlight, and rushlights and medieval castles weren't gloomy caves at all. They were alive with dancing glows, each flame revealing not just the stone walls, but the layered stories of the people who lived within them.